Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It's another day, it's another interesting episode, and we are going to be covering the almighty Steven Seagal and his film debut named Above the Law from 1988. And this is a classic of the genre, the brief genre in Hollywood. In terms of movie making, which was the anti-CIA genre, which took a number of forms, which I'll come to talk about later on. But this is perhaps the one of the premier examples of the anti-CIA movie, and it hits all the hot button issues from the middle 1980s, and of course is very much a Chicago movie as well, given that it was directed by a guy called Andrew Davis, who's still active actually, born in the middle 1940s. He's still directing to this day. He also directed Steven Seagal in Under Siege in 1990, and of course directed one of the first movies I actually remember seeing at the cinema, which is The Fugitive, another Chicago film. And if you notice in the supporting cast in this film, there's a number of actors who are familiar faces from any film that was shot in Chicago at the time where the cops were in it. The captain who's in charge of Seagal's unit, he also turns up in the Andrew Davis film. The Fugitive has basically the same role later on. So interesting Chicago movie. I'll come to the details of it just in a moment, but I would be remiss in my duties as host if I wasn't actually had gone on there. And I'm just pausing here for a moment because I think I've had a slight issue with a disconnection. So if you'll bear with me for just a second, and I'll see if I've got a problem with the internet here. Okay, I think we're all right. So if you're not aware, I'm going to offer a brief comment before we get properly going on the supposed death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man who was the front man for the Wagner organization. And I'll only confine myself at this stage to saying what we actually know, which is that a plane that was registered to Prigozhin was shot down over Tver in the Russian Federation today, apparently shot down or blown up by some kind of explosive device on board, depending upon which interpretation you want to listen to. Lots of wild speculation going around. The Prigozhin fan club has very much opened up again, declaring that the Kremlin has killed Prigozhin because they're getting ready to sell out to the West, and the great hero Prigozhin would have been the only man standing in their way, and that this is why they've also fired Surovikin. This tedious interpretation, of course, is something which I have rejected for quite a long time. Prigozhin and his rebellion, as it turns out, was much more about a squalid dispute over business arrangements and over contracts in the military that was created because of a situation at the disorganization at the start of the special military operation had caused for the Russian MOD, in that they had Wagner playing an outsized role and a man in Prigozhin who was only ever meant to be a frontman for Russian military intelligence, getting ideas above his station, considering himself to be the savior of Russia and all kinds of other things. But Wagner is and was an organization that was founded as a plausible deniability operation by Russian military intelligence, and so it remains. Prigozhin's mini rebellion was a strop, essentially, over a contract dispute. That's what it was. He's not the glorious savior of Russia. This guy was a two-bit thug in the 1980s who cashed in the 1990s like every other piece of slime in the Russian Federation. He benefited hugely from the Yeltsin 90s, reinvented himself as the super patriot who was just a simple businessman running a patriotic mercenary organization. It's all bullshit. And whether he's even dead or not, we don't even know at this stage, of course. A plane registered to him has crashed, either been shot down, blown up, suffered catastrophic technical failure, whatever you like to say. Now, I will only give at this stage my interpretation as to why I do not think that this was some sort of Kremlin hit job. Simply because, like, if they wanted to kill Prigozhin, there's a myriad of other opportunities for doing so. To do so in a way that's so public that would inevitably grab the attention of the media from the hostile countries in NATO, where you've already got BBC, CNN, NBC, Sky, all of the collective West, shall we say, the Western imperialist media organizations covering this 24/7. Putin takes out his rival, that kind of thing. I just do not see what the Russian government would possibly gain from killing Prigozhin in such a public and brutal way as this, and shooting him down, if that is indeed, or blowing up his plane, if that is what is alleged, over Russian territory as well, risking civilian casualties, risking a giant scandal inside Russia itself. It goes against the way in which the Prigozhin rebellion was handled, which is that it could have been handled bloodily. Putin could have ordered those Chechen forces to ride into Rostov-on-Don and kill everybody in there, kill all those Wagner guys, kill Prigozhin himself, but they diffused it via Lukashenko, apparently, without bloodshed. So why do this? Why do some sort of cartoonish execution-style killing involving shooting down an aircraft? To me, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense with what I actually understand about the way in which Putin governs. And even if you do believe, as is probably the case, that certain oligarchs have been taken out, like Boris Berezovsky, and by the way, no one's going to shed a tear for that guy. Well, why do it this way? Why do it so publicly? Why do it when Prigozhin's still a name on the lips of every media outlet in the West and is still something or someone who can be used against you by your enemies, even if he's dead? Why do it now? When Prigozhin's gone off back to Africa, why do it in such a public way? Why not have it done in Africa and pin it on the jihadists or something like that? The way in which this was done, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't fit with the way in which Putin likes to run things inside Russia. And what I mean by that is, even if you believe that Putin is a guy who has people taken out all over the place, and we can certainly discuss that on future episodes, the way in which he seems to like to do things inside Russia is precisely to avoid this kind of thing. If there's anything that defines Putin, it's that he's an anti-radical. He's an anti-revolutionary. He wants to establish, he's a Russian liberal. He wants to establish like the appearance of, even if it's not the reality, of rule of law inside Russia. I mean, I've mentioned before his justice reforms since he took over have been focused upon establishing a fairly liberal system in Russia, eliminating the public power of the mafia, stopping the killing in the streets. I mean, none of the way that this has been done fits with the way that Putin, and not just Putin, the Putin circle, the St. Petersburg circle, who took over in the early 2000s from the Yeltsin clique, the way in which they've chosen to do things inside Russia is very much against this kind of like melodramatic assassination, if indeed he is dead. And it's still speculation at this stage. So I don't buy several things here. I don't buy that this was a hit job ordered by the gangster in the Kremlin, Putin. I just do not think that this is something that he would indulge in. I don't think it's some sort of mutiny by the Russian military to take out their hated rival. And I don't think that this is the kind of way in which they choose to do things at all. And again, like as Peter's saying in the comments, it's much more likely that this was done by CIA or MI6. It's much more likely that they did this and that they'll have the Ukrainians take the credit for it in the form of Kirill Budanov. I think it's much more likely to be a CIA MI6 job than it is to be the Russians, because it just doesn't fit with how I know from many, many hours of reading on the Putin era in Russia, how that entire inner circle of the Kremlin actually like to do things. If they're into nothing else, it's in the appearance of normalcy, calm, and legality in Russia, not this kind of like take out your enemies with a bomb or a missile on Russian territory kind of cartoon villain shit. This much better fits with the image of Putin that the Western powers are trying to sell. So I'll leave it there for now, because anything other than that is just me going to be endlessly speculating, and we don't need that. So I will now move on to what you all came here for, which is, of course, a review of Mr. Steven Seagal's work, again in the form of the 1988 movie Above the Law. Now, I see we've got several people looking forward to this already, including my comrade Jason of the Class Consciousness Project, who wants a future review of the environmental thriller On Deadly Ground, or the Mercenary for Justice, which I've never even seen. So yes, I'll put those on the list. The one I do want to review of Seagal's is Under Siege, which also fits into the post-Cold War era movies. So, for those of you who are unaware, Steven Seagal, of course, was like a fight coordinator for various Hollywood productions before he came up with this idea for a movie, and he co-wrote it with the director Andrew Davis, and was he co-wrote the story and the script, and basically went for a story that was based on his own life. The movie begins with a narration about how he, the Seagal character, was raised in America, but left to study with the masters of Aikido in the East. And it begins with Seagal doing like a sort of slow-mo Aikido masterclass. And I haven't read an awful lot about Aikido as a martial art. There's various different opinions about how good it is. Maybe somebody who knows more than I do can chime in the discussion group about like the precise value of it. But it's an interesting sort of trajectory that Seagal's career has gone on, because he starts off with this, which I think is very much a high point of his certainly his acting roles. He goes on to Under Siege, which is again like I would argue that's a very good thriller. It's basically Die Hard on a boat. And he does some other things, including Under Siege 2 with Eric Bogosian, which is nowhere near as good. And then about the turn of the 20th into the 21st century, things start to go downhill. I kind of enjoy Exit Wounds with him and DMX, but he's already got to the point where he's a bit of a fat bastard at that stage and quite plainly can't be bothered anymore. And now he ends up doing movies where he does fight scenes sitting down. So he's basically become a punchline. This sort of fat guy who used to do like documentaries with really weird American figures like Sheriff Joe Arpaio out in the desert, I think in Arizona. And like he's notoriously now like he's an associate of Putin, according to the Western media, though I think they've met like twice or something. He famously got fed a carrot on camera by Lukashenko. And and now does movies in like Budapest where he has like a younger guy do all the action for him. But in the late 80s, early 90s, he was a guy who was like kind of like not up there with like Willis or Stallone, but was much more of a sort of B-list, sort of younger version of Chuck Norris. And indeed, the director of this movie had directed a previous Chuck Norris movie. So moving on to the artistic side of it, like how does the film look? How does it actually? How can you see it in artistic terms in 2023? I think actually the film actually is very well shot. I like the way that the director puts this together, because it actually feels like quite a almost documentary style shooting, because they shot it inside 60 days, inside 2 months. inside scenes in Chicago. It's shot in a lot of what appear to be like residential areas in Chicago. Like I think you get some shots of what I vaguely recognize as like downtown Chicago. I don't know much about the architecture there. I've been there like once in my life. But it looks like a lot of suburban scenes, which is quite an interesting choice, probably because it was cheaper and easier to film out there. And the film, because they film it that way, I think that the filmmaker, the director, Davis, clearly takes something from like William Friedkin's French Connection, not just in the some of the plot points, but also in the way in which it's shot. There's an early car chase which has Seagal like clinging onto the top of the car, and some of the shots in that are reminiscent of Friedkin's choices in French Connection. And you can also see influences of other like Cop on the Edge, like dramas like Dirty Harry, some of the Stallone stuff from earlier in the decade. And yeah, you can see like the Clint Eastwood influence in there. You can see like the William Friedkin influence in there. But it's very much its own thing. And I think the way it's shot kind of distinguishes it a great deal, because the city of Chicago itself is featured very heavily, and it does give it a real flavor of, well, realism, to be blunt about it, in a way in which, like, if you compare it to other like Cop on the Edge, like Cop takes on protected drug lord dramas from the time period, then you can see it's a cut above those. If you compared this to, like, I don't know, Stallone's Cobra, for instance, which is funny but shite, which is just like Dirty Harry for dummies, or like the Death Wish movies. After Death Wish 1, they just became a complete joke, like a cartoon. Michael Winner just cashing in before his long, slow career nosedive. If you don't know who Michael Winner was like a kind of like a new wave British director. He was kind of an edgy director back in the like 1960s, 1970s. He did the original Death Wish movie with Charles Bronson. And then after that, his career kind of stagnated, and he ended up just doing like repeated Death Wish movies. He did Death Wish 2, which is basically a remake of Death Wish 1, but this time in LA. He did Death Wish 3 back in New York, where Charles Bronson basically acts as a one-man death squad. Hilarious ending, by the way. One of the most over-the-top, strange endings I've ever seen in my life. So I would say that this film compares very favorably to all the other Cop on the Edge movies of that period, of which there were plenty. So because of the way it's shot, because of the cast around Seagal as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that, which is that Seagal himself, I think that even he would admit, is not a great actor. He's good if you put him in the right role. So in this, he's very good. In Under Siege, he's very good. In a lot of other things, not as good. And it's also the case of you need a director and a production team who can keep him under control. For a lot of the movies that, well, I think the environment, the eco warrior movies like On Deadly Ground that Jason's mentioned, that was a case where he'd had the big hit with Under Siege, and once you've had the big hit, you basically then get the opportunity to do some of what you want. And Seagal is a guy with a lot of very odd and contradictory beliefs. He's an actor, so he's clearly not that intelligent. Most actors aren't. And he clearly had an ego on him, or has an ego on him, that ran absolutely wild. And it basically led him to do like ludicrous choices, like, I'm going to do like an eco warrior action movie. I believe that On Deadly Ground, wasn't the villain in that Michael Caine as well? Another man who'll do anything for a check. But in Above the Law, he wrote the story, but he's clearly being directed, and they keep his performance like actually under control, and actually he's very good in this. It's his best acting performance, because clearly he, having written the story and co-written the script, he's invested in it. He's giving some real emotion into the performance in a way that he doesn't really with some of his other films. And also they make the good choice of having a lot of what are generally referred to as character actors around him. So his partner is played by Pam Grier, who of course 10 years later was the lead in the Tarantino movie, one of Tarantino's actually best directed films, called Jackie Brown, which is taken from an Elmore Leonard book called Rum Punch. And she, of course, was the star when she was younger in a lot of the blaxploitation action movies of the early 1970s, like Foxy Brown and things like that. And in this, she's very good. And not only is she very good, but her presence actually elevates the performance of Seagal, because she's able to have an actual good back and forth with him. She plays his partner, and the two of them together actually have some pretty good dialogue together. You kind of buy the fact that they are this unlikely partnership, and her scenes with him elevate his performance, I would say. And you also have a lot of various different like character actors turning up in it, various guys who were in other Chicago movies. So you surround Seagal with like very good actors who can carry the film. You also have Sharon Stone in there as his wife. She doesn't really get a lot to do. But you also have, and I need to give special mention to the performance of Henry Silva, and again, an old character actor who only died last year, in actual fact. He was in the original Ocean's 11 from 1960, and he plays a character called Zargon, and he's the villain of the piece. And yeah, he's excellent in it, as is the Chelsea Ross as Seagal's old partner from his CIA days. So you get a lot of excellent performances. I think it's shot very well. The fight choreography as well is pretty damn good, actually. I mean, you get a lot of like camera cuts. It's not like some of the fight scenes you see in later action movies in the 2000s, where you get fight choreography has obviously come on a long way. It's a little bit more cut and cut and cut, which, if you are familiar with the way they used to shoot a lot of fight sequences back in the like the 70s and the 80s, the way you used to shoot them a lot of the time was, if you weren't using stuntmen, which a lot of the time you were, and you wanted to have the actor in the scene, you'd have the actor like swing a punch, and then you cut, and then you have the stuntman who he's fighting with then fall over, and then you cut again, and then the actor does another move, and then you cut again, and then you cut it together, and it looks as if it's like a put together fight sequence. Like, you look at like the way they used to shoot like Roger Moore fight sequences in his James Bond era, which, looking back on it, is funny. Like Rog, without a hair out of place, takes on like like a whole room full of guys in a fist fight, and it's cut so much that it doesn't look like Roger Moore's moved by the end of the sequence. And he, again, hair still completely in place. Very funny. Roger Moore, incidentally, is one of my favorite James Bonds. I grew up with that guy's movies. A British acting legend, shall we say. But this one, there's a couple of sequences which do really stand out. There's the early sequence where Seagal goes into a bar to retrieve his niece, who is upstairs smoking crack with like some sleazy waiter who works in a club called Bogota. It's a bit on the nose. And the sequence opens up. It also features, I believe, a very young John C. Reilly in one of his first movies as like a barfly sleazebag. And I think Michael Rooker is in that scene as well somewhere. So Seagal goes in there, basically tries to throw his weight around. A couple of like muscle guys at the bar react badly. And there's a fight sequence which is pretty impressively done. There's later one in the alley where a car full of guys try and jump Seagal, and that features a genius move where Seagal gets the guy with a machete who comes at him, deflects his blow to the guy who has the gun in the group, and chops the guy with the gun's hand off, or at least that's what it appears. And then later like defeats them all and picks up the sniveling guy and gets him to grass on his friends. very well put together stuff. Like the gunfights are very well choreographed as well. I think like you get some like gunfights in like 80s movies which are almost unwatchable now. Though it does appear that Steven Seagal has about the same number of bullets in his gun as Clint Eastwood did in the in Where Eagles Dare, where he's just like firing and firing and firing and never actually reaching the end of the magazine. But you know, you suspend your disbelief for stuff like that. So again, from like the standpoint of like a film which is very much of its time, which was fairly low budget, but has a very good cast of character actors around Seagal, which is shot very well, which features the scenes shot in Chicago that makes it feel very real. All of that makes actually artistically something that I would say has still quite a bit of merit to it as a genre piece. So I would say definitely worth checking out purely on the basis if you like a good fight sequence, if you like a good like 80s action movie, but with a little bit of something different to it. And that little bit of something different is, of course, the fight sequences and the way in which it is shot in and around Chicago. All of that makes it very much worth revisiting. And of course, you get the performance of Henry Silva as the villain. And I would say also that the one of the good choices that the director makes is that he uses the villain well, in that he uses him just enough. So Silva is in the first scene in the film, well, really the second scene after the intro, where you're introduced to the Seagal character, because the way the plot works out is that Seagal and his old partner were CIA guys in Vietnam in the early 1970s, and that they were they were doing some kind of shady operation in the Laos-Cambodia border, and the Henry Silva character, the villain of the piece, is he's looking for basically the fact that he's looking for people who've stolen his stolen his opium, basically. And he's torturing a bunch of Vietnamese guys in this hut, and Seagal punches him out, and his partner, who's in the film, is called Nelson Fox, played by the character actor Chelsea Ross, hustles Seagal out of there and says, no, go, you got to go. And so he's introduced, the villain is introduced early on, but then you don't see him again until around about an hour and 10 minutes into the film. You're aware that it's probably him that's out there somewhere, but by actually making sure that the villain is introduced early, but then you don't see him again for a long time, it actually builds up a sense of more of a sense of dread about the villain. Actually, I got the timing there slightly wrong. He's reintroduced again for one brief scene around about the half-hour to 35-minute mark, when it's revealed that he's the guy who's actually got a couple of like mobsters out of prison who Seagal has tried to bust. So to go through the plot, the plot's quite straightforward in many respects. It mirrors a lot of like 80s action movies of the time. You get Seagal trying to bust up these mobsters, and it starts when he, of course, has to retrieve his niece from this crack house. And he also, incidentally, the casting's very good, because even in the minor roles, you get like some Chicago character actors who like got very distinctive faces. Like the guy who runs the bar, who Seagal roughs up early on, has very, very distinctive face. Like he's got like this horrible mullet, like or sort of rat-like features. Not the kind of guy you'd see in a movie these days, I don't think. Very much a sort of 80s look. And Seagal gets a tip from the scumbag who's like smoking crack and obviously having his way with his niece, that there's a big shipment coming in that's hidden in an engine block. So they do a stakeout, they try and recover this engine block, and then there's the extended chase sequence that is caused by the fact that the feds, and in 80s movies, it's not just the CIA that are the villains, it's often the FBI who are the villains as well. And it's an interesting trope that also turns up in Die Hard, that the feds are always getting in the way of like the honest, more working class cop who's just trying to do his job and bust the bad guys, and the feds, i.e. the FBI, or I think in some cases it's like the ATF or other like federal law enforcement agencies. There are always these like hated outsiders who come in and try and take over the case with some shady agenda, or hilariously, in the case of Die Hard, they're blown up because they fly a helicopter over the roof, and that also features in Die Hard Robert Davi as an idiot FBI guy who gets blown up by Alan Rickman. I will come on to Die Hard at some point in the future. In fact, for future reference, maybe we'll consider Die Hard for a Christmas special. But so they try and bust these guys. The feds intervene, cause a shootout. Seagal does get his man though, and they find it's not cocaine or heroin in this engine block. It's actually C4 explosives. So they wonder why that is. They arrest these guys, but then the slimy FBI guys, under the orders of Henry Silva, the villain, Zargon, they get busted out. They get released. Seagal has confrontations with the FBI guys. The plot progresses, and you find out that Seagal then tails them, and they go to his local church where his mother goes, and the priest takes them aside, and they go downstairs, and they find, and this is where the political messaging in the film becomes more obvious. They find like a room full of refugees from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Chile, led by a Costa Rican priest who are hiding in the basement of the church, and a local priest is helping to hide them. And this is where, of course, you start to see the references from the time, because where are the refugees said to be from? They're said to be from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Chile. Now, Chile, of course, we all know, being run by the military regime of Augusto Pinochet, who murdered Salvador Allende in 1973 in a coup. But of course, the slightly lesser known ones these days are, of course, El Salvador, where there was, of course, subject of the early Oliver Stone film Salvador, starring James Woods and Jim Belushi, Belushi's younger brother, where James Woods plays a photojournalist who's going to El Salvador to actually cover the civil war there. And of course, Stone, being a sort of Hollywood leftist, Hollywood outsider sort, wrote this to be a sort of almost pro-communist rebel film. It's remarkable that he got it made, really. But yeah, the refugees are from El Salvador, where, of course, the CIA was running death squads in the 1980s. And they're, of course, from Guatemala, where if you dig into the history of what the American state did in Guatemala, I mean, it makes like the kind of stuff that the Nazis were getting up to in Europe look like almost amateur hour stuff. The amount of killing that went on in Guatemala that was done not just in the 80s, but all the way through the 20th century, whenever the Guatemalans tried to elect somebody who was like just slightly to the left of being an open comprador, the response was always the same, which was mass slaughter. And we can get into Central American genocides conducted by the United States in another episode. Needless to say, the slaughter in Central America in the 1980s was endless and brutal, and the film does reflect that. And I think it reflects quite well on Seagal as a scriptwriter, that he actually put that directly in the film. So it's an interesting choice, and it's, again, reflects well on what Seagal's thinking that he put that in there. So they discover this room full of refugees from some of the places where the CIA is running these death squads. It's interesting that they discover his niece smoking crack early on in the film, which of course is a reference to the crack wave that swept over the United States in the 1980s, which, as we've discussed before, and which I think is very well established by now. In fact, the CIA even admitted to it, that they were actually running cocaine in vast amounts out of Nicaragua and other Central and Southern American nations, including Colombia, in the early 1980s. They were selling it to LA street gangs, who were then turning it into crack cocaine, which becomes the crack wave that goes across America in the 1980s. Reagan declares a renewal of the war on drugs, and of course, you get stuff starting to pop up like demands for mandatory minimum sentences, tougher and tougher laws against drug possession. Loads of people who possess drugs get sent into the prison system. And again, who else is involved in this and ultimately presents the crime bill at the beginning of the 1990s in the US Senate? Why, it's our old friend, President Joe Biden, then just plain old Senator Biden. And look what his son gets up to in his spare time. So again, this is a very, every choice in this, other than the fight choreography and the gunplay, the script all looks like very deliberate political choices. Now, of course, the story about the CIA being involved in the crack wave doesn't actually get broken until around about 93, when a journalist called Gary Webb starts breaking these stories. And of course, the CIA furiously denies it. Later, Gary Webb is found dead, having killed himself, apparently, by shooting himself twice in the back of the head. Rather difficult thing to do, that. This has led to, of course, a lot of speculation that it was either the CIA or the various characters who were associated with them that ultimately killed Gary Webb. But we'll get into the Gary Webb story in a future episode. Needless to say, it is now well established that the CIA was behind the crack wave that hit America in the 1980s. They were the key agency that was involved in starting it. And again, the film addresses this more as we go on. So they discover the refugees in the basement of the church. The priest specifically asks the Seagal character and says, "Why don't you come to church anymore?" And he, having seen the villains snooping around the church, he agrees to go to church on a Sunday with his wife and his kid and his mother. And there's a pretty well done sequence, actually, where there's a bombing in the church, where a woman who's like shrouded up like she's the Virgin Mary or something, leaves a bomb in the church. The way that is shot reminds me a little bit, the way that the woman is shot, the way that she's got the headscarf on, the way she leaves the bag in the church, tells me that the filmmaker has clearly seen the 1960s movie by Hilo Ponkovo, Battle of Algiers, because the way in which that sequence is put together does resemble the bombing sequence from Battle of Algiers. It's another interesting influence on the film. It's one that makes the film a lot more interesting than other similar genre pieces of the time. And film's put together very well, of course, in this sequence, and you can also see there the influence of, again, one of the predecessor movies to this, which is, of course, as I've already mentioned, Oliver Stone's Salvador, which also features the execution of a bishop in a church, which is, of course, based on the execution of Archbishop Oscar Romero, who later was canonized, though at the time the Vatican was very much on the side of the ultra-right-wingers who killed him. So this, again, is meant to conjure up images of the execution of Romero. The good priest is killed in his own church, though it turns out he's not even the target, really. It was the other priest, the Costa Rican priest, who was on the run with the refugees. He's the one who was actually the target, because he was the one who was meant to be giving mass that day. So, and you discover later on in the film that the other target was, of course, a senatorial aide who is as an assistant to a Ted Kennedy type figure, who is leading an inquiry into the activities of the CIA. More on that later. So again, very interesting set of choices for the bombing sequence in terms of the clear influences from another film that the director Andrew Davis chose to draw on for that, and of course the influences from other films. I'd say that Davis has at least watched Salvador by Oliver Stone, and of course he's aware of the murder of Romero in church in the early 1980s. And this, of course, leads Seagal to escalate the situation. He has an angry confrontation at the hospital where the priest is declared dead with the FBI agents. And this sort of escalates things to the point where ultimately Seagal is taken into what is a very traditional 1980s cop movie scene, which is where the captain, in this case I think he's called the superintendent, brings him in with the FBI guys to say, "You're off the case," or "You're off the force," basically. And this is a scene that is very familiar This is a scene that is done in various Stallone movies, various Dirty Harry movies, where like the shouty captain brings the rogue cop who's on the edge into the office to give him a talking to. And in the case of this one, it's the FBI guys and the superintendent, I think his rank is in this one. Just let me check. Yeah. And he's also played by an old blaxploitation actor called Falmus Rasulala, which is a great name. And he's like got a cigar. He's angry. He says to Seagal, "You're off the force." A very traditional 1980s cop scene that many of us would have grown up watching. Like you see, this happens to like Schwarzenegger characters. It happens to Stallone characters. And it happens hilariously, I think, in Cobra with Stallone, where the captain, the nerdy, weak, pencil-necked captain, is actually played by Andrew Robinson, who's of course the Scorpio killer from the first Dirty Harry movie. But that's maybe we'll get to Cobra another day. That would be an interesting contrast to this. But Seagal, of course, goes rogue, and one of the interesting factors in the script is that he's equally related to the Chicago Italian mafia, who in this movie are rather hilariously cast as sort of an honourable cadre of villains, lovable rogues, who watch over Sharon Stone as his wife and his kid when he's on the run. Because, of course, at one point, his old partner calls him up. His old partner from the CIA calls him up and tells him, well, your life's in danger. You got to go on the run. And what happens is, of course, he ultimately works out via a connection with an old contact from his CIA days who's now gone private, that there's a group of CIA assassins operating inside Chicago, taking people out. And of course, it's at this stage that Seagal is trying to track down the Costa Rican priest. And of course, Henry Silva is trying to track him down as well. And ultimately, we get the reintroduction properly of Silva as the villain. And he's very much doing some sort of MK Ultra shit to the Costa Rican priest. He captures him, injects him with truth serum, tortures him. It's clearly conjuring up like the MK Ultra stories from like the 1950s and 60s. And that's another thing that we could spend almost like a whole hour discussing just in and of itself. The remarkable story of the MK Ultra experiments and what they did, including too the recently deceased Mr. Fyodor Kaczynski, or Ted Kaczynski, who was apparently subjected to MK Ultra type experiments when he was at university. And it all came allegedly from a fundamental misunderstanding regarding American prisoners of war in the Korean War, because a lot of the American prisoners of war were given by their captors from People's Korea. They were given books by Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin to read, and Mao, and a lot of them came to the decision that what they were doing was wrong and that the US was an imperialist power. A number of them, and again, this is something we could do a whole program on, defected to the DPRK rather than go home to America. Some of them lived there. I think they lived there, most of the defectors, until they died. Had families there. And it's an interesting callback to that when that American soldier defected quite recently. But from that from that apparent defection, the American imperialists drew the conclusion of, well, the only way that our guys could have been convinced that we were in the wrong was if they'd been brainwashed. And this is apparently one of the impetuses behind the MK Ultra program, to work out how those damn commies were brainwashing people, which of course leads us into another cinematic reference, which is of course the Manchurian Candidate, which is the 1960 film with Lawrence Harvey and Frank Sinatra as two soldiers who survived the Korean War. And the Lawrence Harvey character is meant to be under the control of the shady commies, and his mother, played by, again, the recently deceased Angela Lansbury. So maybe that's another one for the future. But clearly, the way in which the Henry Silva character is trying to is torturing the priest is meant to be callback stuff about MK Ultra, CIA mind control experiments, truth serums, all the other crazy shit that they did actually get up to in the 1960s. So there's another shootout, and Seagal ultimately triumphs. There's various other interesting gunplay sequences, but the big dialogue sequence comes later on when the Chelsea Ross character is reintroduced, who's his old partner from his CIA days, who's still running with this dope smuggling outfit that is essentially a bunch of CIA hitmen. And they have this confrontation, him and Seagal, in the car park, because Seagal's gone to try and take out the Henry Silva character, and they have this confrontation. There's a couple of good lines in it that I wanted to quote, which Seagal says, because the Henry Silva character is on to the sort of Ted Kennedy stand-in, and he's decided that he's going to take out the senator to stop the senatorial inquiry, and which really does date it, because as if the CIA would be bothered these days by a senatorial inquiry. And so Seagal says to his old partner, "Do we kill our senators now?" And his old partner says, "Well, the Roman Republic did," which I thought was quite funny. And Seagal then later says to him, and they're having this back and forth about like basically the American empire and what value that it has. And Seagal says to him, like, "We've wiped out entire cultures, and for what?" Which is quite remarkable that, again, like that got into it was a fairly low budget American movie, but it was an American movie that got released and made quite a bit of money. So it's another interesting thing, an interesting aspect of the film, that this kind of like anti-US empire dialogue got in there, and that Seagal was the one who actually wrote some of it. So ultimately there's a big chase sequence in a car park. Then there's a final fight sequence where Seagal gets injected with the truth serum after Henry Silva captures him and ultimately defeats all Silva's hitmen and breaks the Henry Silva character's neck, and he's acclaimed a hero, etc. Now, the politics of it and the actual reality of this film, which I've just recounted, is very, very interesting, because as is mentioned in the film, it's based on the real events of the so-called Golden Triangle operation in the 1960s and early 1970s that was operating in Vietnam, in Thailand and Cambodia. And this was a real thing, that was a real operation that was run by the CIA, that was based on the growing of opium and its processing into heroin and its transportation back to be sold inside the United States. They started off actually supplying it to American army personnel inside Vietnam and Thailand itself, particularly Thailand, which is where they used to send American personnel for rest and recuperation. And now this is part of the reason why Thailand developed into such a capital of like prostitution and the sex trade, because there was such a sheer number of like American servicemen going through there that it encouraged all kinds of pimps to move into Bangkok to offer, shall we say, certain services for soldiers that mushroomed to the point where it became like a prostitution capital of the world, or one of them. And so that's one of the effects of American imperialism right there. But they then later on went to transporting it back into the States itself, where the sheer amount of it that they were growing and selling, it was meant to be that they were growing it and selling it to finance off-the-books CIA operations. And if you look at the amount of stuff that the CIA got up to in the Vietnam War, I mean, it's truly like horrendous Nazi-style stuff that they were actually doing, which isn't exactly a surprise, because they were designing their anti-communist operations in the Cold War were often designed by people like Reinhard Gehlen, who were like Nazi intelligence officials. And of course, we know now, thanks to the fact that we've been through this program that I've been doing, I've been studying this for over a year with regard to the taking of the Banderists from Eastern Europe over to the United States and Canada, and the incorporation of them into the U.S. intelligence services. This is something that, of course, is very, very real. And they and the German intelligence men who they took out of post-war Germany designed a lot of the anti-communist actions that we saw that defined the Cold War period. So if you look at something like the massacre of the Communist Party of Indonesia in 1965, designed by the CIA, of course carried out by the local hirelings, the Indonesian military under the thug Suharto, but also Indonesian organized crime and, of course, Islamic fundamentalists, the perennial partner of the CIA, along with various drug barons. And this operation, though, came straight out of like the Nazi handbook in World War II, which is, of course, where the CIA got a lot of their inspiration and guidance from. So when you get to something like the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which was the targeted assassination campaign that was meant to destroy on the ground the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. And what it ended up doing, of course, was allowing like CIA psychos to run all over South Vietnam doing essentially mass executions. And that's the kind of stuff they were doing that was somewhat on the books. The off-the-book stuff went even more wild and crazy, and again will be the subject of a future program in and of itself. But so the beginning of the movie, the beginning of Above the Law, does feature this. It features the fact that these operations that were being run by the CIA were essentially making the Central Intelligence Agency and thus the American government into one of the world's biggest drug dealing operations, if not the biggest, which of course takes its inspiration directly from the old British Empire, who became the biggest opium dealers in the world in the 1840s and continued to essentially run a narco empire for the rest of the 19th and into the 20th century. So no better person to run a drug trade than a fine, upstanding Anglican or Protestant people. But the key thing about the influence here is that it comes on Above the Law, is that it comes from a very real place. It comes from the fact that the CIA in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and Thailand were running like a gigantic narcotics dealing operation, which of course leads to a Watergate. Was not that Nixon had violated the sacred American Constitution. I mean, if you believe that, the more you look into Watergate, the more you find that like the Woodward and Bernstein story is essentially an intelligence operation in and of itself. The actual reason why Nixon got taken out was because he had a falling out with the CIA and the FBI over various different things. And that's kind of portrayed in the Oliver Stone Nixon movie, that he, having had this long and productive relationship with the intelligence services, suddenly had a falling out with them when he became president. Not over anything good, but more of a sort of pissing contest. And they decided to eliminate him, not in the JFK way, but more in the sense of like ending his political career by leaking some of the things that he actually had been doing. But one of the reasons why Nixon was trying to build and run his own intelligence service via the plumbers, who actually weren't very good at it, was because he had fallen out with the FBI and CIA and wanted to have his own men who he could rely on. And this is what Mark Felt, Deputy Director of the FBI, was leaking to Bob Woodward, who, by the way, was a former intelligence man, and you never really leave the intelligence services. And so the version of Watergate we got served up via both the stories at the time and the Alan J. Pakula movie, which I may review at some stage, which is a very good movie, very entertaining, but it's not actually the reality. The reality is that Nixon was taken out because of a pissing contest he got involved in with the CIA and the FBI. The Oliver Stone movie is slightly more accurate when it comes to portraying that, and that's why he got taken out. It was a squalid power struggle which involved deep state actors taking out a president, basically. And one of the reasons why, the legitimate reasons why, like the Democrats thought that they could imitate that to do in Trump, was because that was the reality of what had happened to Nixon. It wasn't a case of heroic journalists pursuing the truth against a rogue president. It was a case of a president falling out with his intelligence services and the intelligence services ending his career, politically speaking, albeit in a more subtle and civilized way than they did with JFK. Interesting diversion, but that links back to, of course, the CIA running a drug racketing ring inside the United States. That, according to one of Nixon's more sympathetic biographers, is one of the reasons why they had a falling out. Now, whether you believe that or not depends upon how seriously you want to take the idea that Richard Nixon grew a conscience. We'll see. I think it was more of a power struggle myself. But the fact is that the heroin wave that hit America in the early 1970s can be traced back directly to the narcotics production activities of the CIA in the 1960s and early 70s inside Indochina. And then the crack wave that hits the United States in the 1980s can be traced back now by admission of the CIA to their activities in Central America in the late 1970s, early to mid 1980s. And then we get to the narcotics wave, including like things like fentanyl, which hits the United States in the last 10 years, coinciding with the occupation of Afghanistan and the re-emergence of poppy growing on a mass scale and opium production on a mass scale, when, of course, Afghanistan had been turned into a CIA playground, just the same way that Central America was in the 1980s and Southeast Asia was in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, are we looking at a series of coincidences here, or is it the fact that wherever and whenever the CIA goes anywhere, they set themselves up as independent businessmen, shall we say, selling narcotics on the side to finance their dubious operations? It certainly seems like that is the case. When it happens in three major conflict areas, which have seen significant American military action, and three separate centers of drug production start selling various narcotics back on the streets of the United States. And of course, the agency that does this is so secret, you can't even learn its budget and you can't question it. And now it has a protected status, which is much more advanced than it was in the 80s. See, in the 80s, you got Above the Law criticizing the CIA. You got even Predator, which is features of it's an Arnold battles an alien. But the reason why they're there, of course, if you don't remember, is of course that the Carl Weathers character, Dylan, is running a shady operation involving trying to capture the Predator using the Special Operations Squad as bait. And the background plot involves the US launching raids against apparently communist guerrillas in an unnamed South American country. So again, even Predator has like an anti-intelligence services bent to it. Even things like the Rambo movies, like Rambo 2, which is basically where Sly Stallone goes back to Vietnam and refights the war and gets to win this time, has as its villain not even really the Vietnamese, they're just there for Sly Stallone to shoot at, but the villain is actually a CIA guy. And later on, again, we're keeping in the genre of the Steven Seagal movies, who is a genre in and of himself. Under Siege features rogue CIA guy played by Tommy Lee Jones, who's trying to blackmail the American government because it's the end of the Cold War and he's out of work. Or later, or similar time period, you get Die Hard 2, directed by Rennie Harlin, where Bruce Willis now, rather than taking on like sleazy Euro villain terrorists who are actually bank robbers, he's now taking on Bill Sadler, who's like a special forces guy who is trying to bring back into power a like sort of General Noriega type figure, and is trying to do that via the hijacking of an entire airport. I must revisit that at some stage as well. And again, like even stuff like Commando, you have Arnold taking on a bunch of US intelligence guys who are trying to get a sleazy Central American dictator figure played by, I think, by the great Dan Hedaya back into power by persuading Arnold to be on their side by kidnapping his daughter. And it features a hilarious sequence where Arnold defeats an entire army using guns and also the implements from a shed. Brilliant piece of work. So in the 80s, the CIA were the villains, very much the villains. And you go back even earlier, the old Robert Redford movie, 3 Days of the Condor. Another really interesting piece of work, which features, again, Redford as a betrayed CIA agent. I think, I need to look it up again, but I think that's an Alan J. Pakula movie as well, where he is, of course, is a CIA desk clerk, basically, who is on the wrong side of a betrayal and then gets hunted by a hitman played by Max von Sydow. So this genre of CIA as villains was a really strong one, and you got it in a lot of mainstream. You don't get much more mainstream than an Arnold action movie from the 1980s. Like Arnold, it's hard to think of it now, but like in the 80s, like Arnold was untouchable. Like he was probably the biggest star in the world, I would say. It's him, between him and Sly Stallone. Humorous anecdote regarding the rivalry between the two of them. Apparently, Arnold pranked Sly Stallone into doing the 1990 film Stop or My Mom Will Shoot, which features Sly teaming up with one of the Golden Girls, actress called Estelle Getty, which features the hilarious sequences where Sly's a cop on the edge who has to hilariously move in with his mother, and hilarious consequences result. And so, yeah, go watch that one if you want to watch something that's just really fucking weird. But Arnold apparently pranked Sly Stallone into doing it by leaking to Sly that he was actually wanting to do that film himself. And so Sly Stallone jumped on the script and said he'd do it, and Arnold was having a joke with him. I like to think that that story is true, because I grew up as somebody who like started watching films in like the early 90s. Like one of my first VHS memories is like Kindergarten Cop with Arnold. One of the first VHS tapes I ever bought was Terminator 2. So grew up absolutely loving Arnold movies. And later he disgraced himself with that whole governor of California business. And now he goes around like crying on Twitter about Trump and climate change. It's like, talk about like living long enough to see your idols all fall. I much preferred Arnold when he was like some cigar smoking asshole. When he started becoming like some annoying liberal, like weakling, it's very, very disappointing. But I digress slightly. But if you want to see the premier and outstanding Arnold performance, of course, you have to go back to Conan the Barbarian, one of the best. So, returning to the drug trade and the CIA and their portrayals over the years, so like the way in which the CIA is portrayed now, even in movies which are purport to be critical of them, like the Bourne films. Remember the conclusion of the Bourne films, which is where the CIA actually turns out to be the good guys because they're redeemed by Joan Allen, the Joan Allen character at the end, and of course Scott Glenn and Albert Finney, the villains in that, along with David Strathairn and Chris Cooper, and they all end up getting taken down by some heroic congressional investigation. And what you learn from that is that the very end of the film, the Matt Damon character, the Bourne character, says to Albert Finney, who's like the scientist who designed him in a lab or something and ran MK Ultra shit on him, says, "Oh, I'm not going to kill you because you're not worth a star on the wall at Langley." So at the end of that film, the Paul Greengrass trilogy, it became a quadrilogy in the end, but nobody really counts the fourth one, or the weird one with Jeremy Renner in the middle. You end up with the CIA being redeemed, and in a way that it isn't in Above the Law. In Above the Law, you get like a cursory scene at the end where the senator is investigating the agency, but the agency is not redeemed. The agency is condemned through the fact that these guys are, as Seagal says it, it's like, you think you're above the law. Well, you're not above my law, etc. So in the middle, this dumb, apparently dumb, but I'd say actually far more intelligent action thriller from like the middle 1980s has far better politics to it, and he's actually legitimately, I would say, almost anti-imperialist, Steven Seagal anti-imperialist hero, than the glossy Bourne movies in the 2000s with Matt Damon in them, because what they're designed to do is to ultimately recuperate the reputation of the CIA. Because you get these, the Treadstone program in the Bourne movies, which is basically, and again, it's a reference to MK Ultra, is taken from, of course, old Robert Ludlum books. And the way that Greengrass, who, the more I look at Paul Greengrass and his career, the more I'm thinking that this guy was actually cooperating with the CIA on some basis. Because if you look at the trilogy of movies that he made about the Jason Bourne movies, if you look at like his work on Green Zone, which was basically a gloss job for the CIA. It was the CIA versus the neocons in that one. If you want to watch a hilarious CIA propaganda piece, go and watch Green Zone. And of course, he made United 93, which was the story, and I do emphasize the term story, of the plane that was crashed due to the apparently heroic actions of the passengers who tried to wrestle back control of it on 9/11. Now, of course, you do any cursory amount of research about what actually happened to that plane, and it was blown up in the sky, probably by the US military. because, of course, you just go and look at the pattern of the debris and the way that it fell. A plane hits the ground at the speed at like hundreds of miles an hour, which is apparently what it was doing. You end up with a massive impact crater, and the debris would have been far more together. What you see in the case of United 93 in the real world is that there's a slight there's burn marks, but the debris is scattered all over the place, and there's almost no impact crater. So it's clear that that plane got shot down in midair. They made up the story about the passengers heroically retaking it, and Greengrass, as a loyal CIA scribe, went and made a whole movie about it. And then you get the Bourne movies, of course, to return back to them, where, of course, at the end of it, it turns out it was all rogue operators and the good CIA's back in charge again. And so that's the very much more and more reactionary turn. So you have this brief moment with Above the Law and other films from the mid to late 80s, which were allowed to portray the CIA as a villainous, gangsterish organization, to the 2000s after 9/11, where the CIA are the good guys. They're even the good guys where they're facing off against the evil bureaucrats who made us invade Iraq, if you can believe that particular narrative. That was a story that was floating around in the mid-2000s that was clearly a product of an interagency dispute between the White House and the CIA that the CIA managed to get turned into a whole movie. And so when you see like the post 2016 turn to like the CIA being the great defenders of American democracy versus like the evil Trumpian types, it's not exactly a surprise, because I think after the middle 80s, the CIA started spending a lot of money on propaganda, more to the point they started spending a lot of money on influencing Hollywood studios to portray them in a positive light. Another example, and here we get the other side of the Matt Damon-Ben Affleck partnership, is the movie Argo, which is a movie about how the actual heroes in the Iranian Revolution of 1979 to 80 was Ben Affleck, who managed to heroically extract some of the Iranian hostages by pretending to make a movie in Iran. Never mind the fact that the American imperialism mercilessly destroyed Iran for many, many years by imposing the Shah on it. Or the fact that the CIA was happy to do business with Khomeini and his government in the 1980s to keep the funds flowing to the Contras in Nicaragua, as part, of course, of the Iran-Contra scandal. So it's very interesting that clearly after the spate of movies portraying them as villains, the CIA started taking much more seriously the idea that they had to influence Hollywood. And of course, you start to get that trend from certainly into the 90s, and then really takes off after the 2000s with the idea of the CIA as the great heroic defenders. Another movie that would be in this tradition of like the good old-fashioned CIA versus the evil neocons would be a movie like the mid-2000s Ridley Scott movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, which I have temporarily forgotten the name of, where DiCaprio plays a CIA agent who's sort of neocon type boss, played by Russell Crowe, is insisting on doing all kinds of things, all kinds of dodgy stuff involving it's Body of Lies. That's the one. Body of Lies with Leo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe, where the Russell Crowe figure is the one who's gone rogue and is betraying the good, honest CIA agent played by Leonardo DiCaprio. Also features Mark Strong as a Jordanian. Mark Strong, British actor. We have a similar hairline, but because he's like vaguely Mediterranean in his look, he gets cast as everything from like Mexicans to Jordanians. So this genre of the CIA as the good guys is, of course, something which is very firmly established in the decaying fetid corpse of Hollywood these days. And final thing I'll say on this is that the Hollywood movies and American filmmaking in the 1980s, I think probably represents like a last burst of creativity. Yes, you still get like good films into the 1990s. But I'll conclude on it by talking about something more artistic here, which is that the breakdown of the old studio system in the 1960s and then rolling into the 1970s, you get like the new independent Hollywood. You get like Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, even George Lucas. Like George Lucas, if you watch like THX 1138, I think that's a great film, a great piece of sci-fi, which, funnily enough, was referenced in the only good Star Wars product of recent years, which is the series Andor. If you haven't watched that yet, be sure to check it out. Um, and you get people like Francis Ford Coppola, who was a scriptwriter prior to making The Godfather. He wrote the movie Patton, which incidentally is what Patton's reputation is really based on. That film, not the reality of Patton, the military guy who was actually much more of a chancer and a failure. If you want more on that, go and watch some of Andrei Martinov's great rants about how shit Patton was. I don't always agree with that guy, but when he's right, he's right. But the Hollywood in the 70s, when you get this surge of like the independent like film school guys, Spielberg is kind of one of them as well, who are making movies that are breaking the mold, especially Scorsese, especially early Brian De Palma. You go and watch the early Brian De Palma stuff. I think some of it's absolutely magnificent. Carrie is an absolute masterwork. You get people also like John Milius, who is also a product of New Hollywood. He's like one of my favorite ultra-reactionary directors. The guy who wrote the second Dirty Harry movie, the guy who wrote and directed Conan the Barbarian. He wrote like dozens of other things. He wrote famously the speech given by Robert Shaw, the Robert Shaw character Quint in Jaws, all about the sinking of the U.S. vessel that delivered the nuclear bomb, and how the real story of how the crew went into the water and got eaten by sharks over several days. He's another one of the new Hollywood people. My point here is, all of those guys were a part of a great burst of creative energy that gave Hollywood a new life in the 70s. And that lasted, that even though that got kind of taken over by the new studio system in the 80s, it lasts through the 80s. So you still get stuff like Above the Law, you still get stuff like Die Hard, you still get stuff like even the Arnold movies, which were mainstream action movies, but they had a little bit more about them. Had a little bit more grit and a little bit more dirt to them, shall we say. And then that lasts to the 90s. And really, it's since the turn of the century that you start to see that burst of creativity that came from the 70s and lasted 2 decades into the 90s has that's all run out by the time you get to the 2000s. You even get a director like Tarantino who has done some interesting things. I don't think he ever got over the career peak that was Jackie Brown, though, to be honest. Like things like Inglourious Bastards and Hateful Eight are interesting films, but they're ultimately very derivative of things that were much better done by other directors before him. More on Tarantino in the future. So you find that Hollywood has lost creativity and has lost the ability to make any interesting things probably since, definitely over the last 20 years. It's really become sharply into focus after about 2008, when they realized they could pump out like mid-market trash, not even mid-market, like low-rent corporate goop in the form of superhero movies, and make a packet on them. And then you get the series of mergers that go through from the 2000s onwards, where you end up with like Disney and Warner Brothers owning just about everything. And of course, monopolization and a general decay in American capitalism anyway causes an atmosphere of like make a fast buck, of crippling conservatism, of like artistic deterioration, a lack of good scripts, a lack of good storytelling, a lack of ability of filmmakers to take a risk. Everything has to fit into like a cookie cutter production line. And so you end up where we are. And so an Above the Law can't get made today, I don't think. Maybe it would in like purely independent cinema, but you wouldn't get that released by a major studio today. I just don't think you would have the flexibility out there to be able to take a risk even on a relatively low budget film like that anymore. Certainly not one with the political messaging. So I will now leave it there. I will, before I go though, I will catch up on the various comments because I'm aware there's been quite a few. So, right. So I need to watch Mercenary for Justice by Seagal. That needs to be added to the list. And On Deadly Ground. Irish Partisan says, On Deadly Ground was an enjoyable film, but also tongue-in-cheek humour. Michael Caine was the villain. I had hoped that Caine would have been eaten by Jaws, but alas. Of course, Michael Caine infamously in Jaws 4, a movie he took on because it was being shot in the Bahamas. So, Philbin says, I knew Marx, Engels, Lenin Institute rocks. Pam Grier, Jackie Brown reference. The neck snapping move at the end of Above the Law is so epic. I remember guys in the army trying it on each other with mixed results. Yeah, I remember trying it on people in the schoolyard back when we were watching, like, I think it's because we were influenced by like WWF when we were in primary school. I don't know if anybody out there is similar age to me, but like when we were in primary school, we used to collect like the WWF trading cards. Used to watch it on TV, and like you would try like the apparent like back breaking and neck snapping moves, and of course you end up hurting each other because we're not actors. Irish Partisan says Henry Silver also appeared in the remake of Buck Rogers 1979 where he played Kane, one of the co-villains. Interesting fact. Die Hard for Christmas Special, says Peter. Good timing, yes. Henry Silver was an accomplished actor. He excelled in the roles of either villain or anti-hero. He spent a lot of time in the 60s and 70s starring in various Italian noir crime thrillers. Yeah, I'd never heard of him until I watched this film. I didn't know he was in the original Ocean's 11 either. So everybody seems to be in favour of the Die Hard Christmas Special. Thank you, Philbin, for that quote, contribution. Red Star Betty says, Act of Killing, sickening 2012 documentary. Yeah, if you've not seen it, go and watch that. That's a very interesting piece of work about the genocide. It was sponsored by the American and British imperialists in Indonesia in 1965. Which Barack Obama's stepfather was intimately involved in, by the way, because he was a CIA guy in Indonesia. Philbin says, Woodward's assignment to the White House during brief stint in naval intel was certainly curious. Nixon's downfall is being re-examined by some in the US left, albeit reluctantly, from what I can tell. Yeah. I think the Nixon downfall and the whole Watergate mythos is a piece of bullshit we have to explode, because Nixon was actually brought down for all the wrong reasons. Much like Trump, Nixon was brought down, I think, because he actually wanted to, he dared to actually try and rule himself. Not that what he wanted to do was much good, but the mythology around Watergate and the mythology of the great American liberal media is such bullshit that does need to be taken down. Jason says, I'm running off a list of his favourite films. Okay, we're definitely adding Conan to the list. Red Star Betty likes that one. Sword and sorcery flicks were fab. Yes, indeed they were. As well as 9/11 creating a need to clean up the image of the CIA. It wasn't until around 2000 that we had internet social media. Very good point from Jerry. John Milius did indeed co-create the show Rome. Again, he's one of my favourite reactionary filmmakers. And President Jesus says, we need to watch Arnold in Red Heat to see how he deals with communism. Yes. Arnold with Jim Belushi in Red Heat, a classic end of Cold War movie. Maybe one for the future. But it is now time for me to knock this on the head for this evening because I have an early start in the morning. I hope you've enjoyed this run through of Above the Law. I'll be returning next week with another film which is to be announced. Keep an eye out for the review of Solaris coming soon on the Patreon. Thank you to everybody who's watched the stream tonight. Be sure to like and share it across various different platforms. Spread the word of the good work of Steven Seagal. Until tomorrow,